Grateful for your faithfulness in this journey through Mark that we've taken together. This morning we are on the last of the Mark story that ends at the tomb of Jesus. We'll talk about the other verses that follow that at the end of our reading. Let's begin with this reading. We're at 16:1 through 8 today. Let's read the first two verses. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, and Salome brought spices so that they might go and anoint him. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. So now we have the return of the three women, the same women that were at the foot of the cross. Salome wasn't part of the Joseph of Arimathea burying Jesus in the verses before. If you remember, two Marys, it said Mary the mother of Joseph, and now it says Mary the mother of James. Whether that's the same person or not, we're not quite sure. This isn't probably Mary the mother of Jesus, who also, it seems, had a son named James, who became the guy who wrote the letter James that's in our Bible, and was the head of the early church as the brother of Jesus. So this Mary must be a different Mary, probably the disciple James, who's a different James than the brother of Jesus. All that is confusing, and none of it terribly important. Probably the most important thing about these women is one, that as a group, they are the most faithful people throughout this whole crucifixion and resurrection. All the disciples have scattered, the male disciples have scattered, and it's only these female disciples that faithfully come to, that want to do the right thing by Jesus. So they are the most courageous of the disciples. And then they're bringing spices. So that I said last week that they saw Joseph of Arimathea, who volunteered to bury Jesus before the sun went down, before the Sabbath started. But he did the minimal amount for Jesus's body that you could do. He just threw him in a linen sack, basically. The women saw this and they wanted to do right by Jesus. And the most that they could do would be anoint him with spices. That's how you bury a king. So in order for these three women who we assume are poor to get spices, they would have had to have somebody like Joseph of Arimathea or someone wealthy give them to him to do this. So they are treating Jesus as a king. And it's important to them that they honor this man that they've loved, that they follow, that they believe is the Messiah. That they treat his body well. So the first opportunity they have, which would be Sunday morning, Sabbath ends Saturday night. It doesn't seem very likely that they're going to come out on a Saturday night to this tomb. So Sunday morning, as soon as day breaks, it tells us they go and they go to this tomb. Okay. The next two verses, verses 3 and 4. So they had been saying to one another, "Who will roll away the tomb for us from the entrance to the tomb?" And when they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled back. Mark has kind of a detour about this stone. Many stones of tombs, as I said last week, weren't that large that they could have been rolled back by women. Mark wants to be sure we understand that this was a large tomb and thus had a large stone. I told you that they put ridges in the bottom of the stone and in the bottom of the tomb so that you could push these stones back and forth along these ridges, because they were meant to be opened up and closed and opened up and closed, because they were used not just once but for generations. Bodies would decompose in these tombs, and then they would be put in a box called an ossuary, and then more bodies would be put in the tombs. But this stone was so large, as it says in verse 4, that these three women, no matter how hard they tried, could have rolled it away. Mark's purpose for that is probably the same as Mark's purpose for telling us that Pontius Pilate made sure the body was dead. Because there were stories probably that the disciples themselves had stolen the body of Jesus from the tomb in order to tell their falsehood that Jesus was resurrected. And so Mark wants to be sure that those stories that must have been alive in the congregation that surrounded Mark in 67, 70 AD when he wrote these words that they know that the women did not steal those that body, and that the men weren't around. Okay. And so finally, one other thing is when they saw the tomb rolled away, when they saw the stone rolled away, their first reaction isn't that Jesus was resurrected, because they wouldn't be thinking that was going to happen, even though Jesus had foretold his resurrection. They still probably wouldn't have likely thought that this was what was going to happen. When they saw that tomb rolled away, their first thinking would have been, oh my, someone has stolen the body of Jesus and desecrated it. Which was something that might have happened in Jesus's day, and their heart would have broken, just like your heart would break if someone you loved greatly, was desecrated in death. So when they see the tomb open, their heart breaks. Verse 5. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. So they come into the tomb, and they expect to find Jesus's body gone, or worse, desecrated in some horrific way. But instead, they find a young man in a white robe. So we're to hear this right away, and I'm sure you did as a Bible reader now, that this is a heavenly being. This young man in a white robe. The white robe is the purity of heaven. Sitting on the right side, that's kind of an unusual detail. That probably means that he is in the authority of God, that God has sent this angelic being, and he's sitting on the right side, which is where people sat next to the king in order to carry out the orders of the king. And so that this angelic messenger comes right from God, God's self. And there's also a sense here, you remember that curtain that ripped when Jesus died on the cross, the curtain in the temple that hid the Holy of Holies from the rest of the world? And we said that that curtain ripping is probably a symbolism of this heaven and earth coming together. That there's a thin space that's been broken through that separates us from heaven. And now this angel showing up as a sign of this heaven and earth coming together. And of course, the sign of this heaven and earth coming together is going to be ultimately the resurrected Jesus, who is a heavenly being that now walks among us and with us. It says the women were alarmed. Another translation of that might be astonished, that they couldn't make sense of this. Alarmed sounds like they were afraid. The Greek word is probably just their mind was blown. What is going on here? The next two verses. But he said to them, do not be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. Look, there is the place they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of you to Galilee, and there you will see him, just as he told you. So these important words of the angel are that don't be astonished, make sense of this. You came here looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who died, was crucified, and now the angel tells him, but he's been resurrected, he's been raised, and he's no longer here. And then he gives them instructions to go and tell the disciples and Peter, which is interesting, right? Because Peter is one of the disciples. So why does the angel point out Peter? And surely the reason is because Peter's been crucial in this whole passion story. It's been Peter that said he would be faithful even unto death. And then hours after he said that, he was unfaithful and denied that he even knew Jesus. And even worse, he hasn't been accompanying Jesus along this walk of crucifixion at all. So not only was he unfaithful and denied that he even knew Jesus, he didn't stay with Jesus. And so the angel tells these women, who are the only ones brave enough to follow Jesus to the cross, to the tomb, and now on Sunday morning, to go and tell the disciples that Jesus is going ahead of you to Galilee. They followed Jesus from the first day of Galilee, and they are still following the dead and resurrected Jesus. And there you're going to find him, just as he told you. And Galilee is interesting because Galilee is where they are from, right? That's the part of the world that they are from. But we also know that Galilee is more Gentiles in it than Jews, and that Galilee was known as a Gentile part of the world. Um, and the reason the Jews were there, the reason we even believe that there is a Nazareth, is that it was a village created to provide Jewish laborers for all the Roman cities that were being built in Galilee. And so Jesus is going to Galilee, not just the hometown of all these disciples, and not just the most likely place for these disciples to go after, anyways, because they weren't from Jerusalem. But he's going to Galilee to start a ministry to people who aren't Jewish. Um, that that God came to save not just the Jews, but God came to save the Jews and all of creation. So the ministry towards the rest of the world, towards us, begins on this first day of resurrection. And finally, we're to know that we are going to find Jesus in Galilee. So there's no Jerusalem resurrection appearance of Jesus in the book of Mark. That you find Jesus not in Jerusalem gathering his disciples. You find Jesus already in Galilee, leading his disciples out into the world. So Jesus comes to Jerusalem, the center of godness in this biblical life, dies, and then goes back out to share that godness in the resurrection to the rest of the world. Is kind of the vision of that. Now the last verse. So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. This is really interesting, too, that we have in the midst of this. Scholars are pretty sure that that's how it ends. I'm going to just do the verse first, and then we'll talk about this unusual ending. So they fled from the tomb, and they said nothing to anyone. So finally, these courageous women who have done so much for Jesus and stayed with Jesus, even though their life could be threatened by it, freeze up and don't do the right thing at the very last minute. So Mark, who has consistently shown us disciples who have cold feet, shows us even the bravest of the disciples, women, have cold feet at the end too. So it's an encouraging word for disciples at the end of the day, because we know that these women eventually must have told someone, because we have this story. They just didn't do it right away. And however it got out, and however the disciples ended up meeting the resurrected Jesus in Galilee, we don't know. But it doesn't seem like these women were part of that they failed at the end themselves. However, if you were in 67 AD and hearing the story, you would know that Mary Magdalene, you would know the rest of the story of these three women. And my guess is that the rest of the story is a good one, that these women did become outstanding disciples and leaders of the early church for Jesus. So you're hearing the story and you're saying, oh my goodness, even Mary Magdalene failed. Even Peter failed. And yet I know them to be bulwarks of the church and believers in Jesus. And yet they're like me. They have clay feet and they get afraid and they don't do the right thing and they don't listen to what God is telling them to do. So we can find hopefulness in the failure of these disciples as people that are like us. And what they're afraid of is not their own lives. What they're afraid of is what this all means. You know, what does it mean that Jesus was resurrected? That all the world has changed because of this resurrection. Now, there aren't too many scholars that believe the next 12 verses of Mark were the original words of Mark. In fact, scholars believe that the next 12 verses came around in the 3rd and the 4th century because there was a dissatisfaction with the story ending there. And we have to admit, it's an unusual ending, right? Um, Resurrected Jesus never shows up here in this story. He's in the future. And surely Mark knew of stories of the resurrected Jesus. In Luke, Matthew, and John, we have specific different stories of the resurrected Jesus showing up. But we don't have that here. We also don't have the men even coming to the empty tomb. Whereas Luke, Matthew, and John, we do have the men showing up at the empty tomb also. So we have the story of these brave women, the men completely losing their stuff and not coming around at all. Only the women who couldn't vote, who couldn't own property, who couldn't hold a job, the lowest in the caste system of Jesus's time, they're the only ones who are at the tomb, and then they fail too. So it is a terribly unusual ending. And so what we believe is that in the 3rd or 4th century, scribes put a better ending on. But the church still decided that that better ending was canonical, meaning that the Holy Spirit was part of that. So we'll look at those next 12 verses next week. But let's just imagine that it ends here, as scholars believe. And if that's true, well, what Mark wants us to hear is the story of the discipleship continuing. So Mark is kind of turning the story over to us. These women go to Galilee and they find the resurrected Jesus. We can go to Galilee, out in the midst of ministry among people who don't believe, and find the resurrected Jesus. That Jesus isn't going to be contained in some tomb, that Jesus isn't going to be contained in some temple. Jesus is going to be out and about in the world. And that when we go out and about in the world to share the good news of Jesus, we will find the resurrected Jesus in ourselves, that we carry the Holy Spirit. We carry the spirit of the resurrection when we go to the Gentile worlds, when we go to the worlds that don't believe ourselves. And in order to do that, we need to overcome our fear of being rejected, that when we bring this good word, fear of what the world will do to us if we make ourselves vulnerable, like Jesus did. I mean, picking up and carrying your cross isn't an order to go to the jewelry store and buy a pretty cross. It's an order to sacrifice in the name of love, as you two sang, no matter what the consequences might be, because that's what Jesus does. If the story ends here, then the real focus isn't on the resurrection stories of Jesus. The real focus is on God keeping God's promises on the cross. That God will love us no matter what, even if that love brings harm and pain to God, God's self. That's the power of the cross. That God's promise to love you will not end when you say no. That God's promise to love you lasts even beyond your no's. So by ending here, Mark is saying the resurrection is happening around us. This thin spot between heaven and earth has been broken open. When Jesus preached his first sermon, that the kingdom of God is drawn near, that's his first sermon in Mark. Now it has drawn near completely. Now it is here in the midst of this, in the midst of this world. So go and find Jesus out there. And in Mark, the disciples, it's not miracles that make people believe. It's the word of Jesus that make people believe. And we carry that word of Jesus. So it's not the miracles that we do. Walking through walls in the resurrection story, showing up suddenly unexpected in a meal in the Emmaus, in the village of Emmaus, in Luke's story of the resurrection, helping the disciples catch fish in John's story of resurrection. Mark's saying all those miracles, they're wonderful, but that's not what makes people believe. What makes people believe is encountering the word of Jesus. It's the word of Jesus and the goodness of that made Jesus' enemies so afraid and that caused them to kill them. It wasn't the miracles. So the miracle resurrection, Mark could have told us those stories, but he must have thought that they would just distract us from what we are to do. We are to go to Galilee, overcome somehow our fear and our terror at being exposed as a Jesus lover, and declare the good news that God's promises last, and that our no's are weak compared to God's yes. Thank you. We'll do those last 12 verses next week. I always appreciate you joining me every week. Thank you.